Guten Tag und hallo. Heute heute müssen wir wieder mal über Verben reden. Ich bin Billy Badger und das ist Bausteine 1. Herzlich willkommen. Well, in our course, we have already introduced verbs, and by now we know that a sentence generally only has one subject and one verb in it. But we have already had a couple of examples where we've used two verbs. So, for example, we've made prognoses. When we were talking about the weather, for example, we used the verb werden that allows us to make those prognoses. Es wird morgen vielleicht regnen. Or es wird morgen 13 Grad haben. We've also used two verbs in a sentence by starting with the verb gehen in that second position. Sie geht samstags einkaufen. She goes shopping on Saturdays. Or wir gehen samstags Bier trinken. We go drinking beer on Saturdays. But you could just as easily put quite a lot of other different action verbs at the end of that sentence. Surfen, Skifahren, Radfahren, laufen, spazieren, wandern, and so on. And so today we're going to look at two more really useful ways of using two verbs in our sentences that will allow us to be much more flexible and expressive with what we say in German. So let's get started. Also fangen wir an. For a start, I want to look at probably our most common way of using two verbs. This is where we introduce modal verbs. Useful little verbs that we are pretty much always going to use along with another verb, another action verb. Well, what are we talking about here? Well, we've got them in English too. Here, modal verbs allow us to say, for example, not just I'm reading my book, for example, but I have to read my book, or maybe I should read my book, or perhaps even I want to read my book, or I can read my book, or even I'm allowed to read my book. So as you can see, they give us a little bit more context about the reading that we're doing. They help us get across the idea of whether it's something you have to do or something you really want to do, or maybe it's something you know you should be doing, but maybe you don't want to do. It can express the idea of something that you're able to do, or for that matter, something that you can't do. Because perhaps at that moment there is something else that you have to do. So as you can see, these are all verbs that allow us to talk about what we do in a different way. And for the most part, they aren't a lot of use by themselves, but they only really become useful when we start to use them together with other verbs. All right, so what are these mystical modal verbs in German? Let's have a look. In German, we'll be using our verbs müssen, sollen, wollen, können, dürfen, and möchten. And they each behave in, well, funny ways, but they all behave in similar ways. Now, the reason for this is the endings are a little bit different to those that we are used to the ones that we've been using now for quite a few weeks. Now, in the plural forms, our modal verbs get really just the normal endings, those ENs and the Ts that we're used to. But in the singular forms, look, they don't even really bother with endings for a lot of the time, which is perhaps kind of handy for those of us who tend to forget to use verb endings, yeah? So today, I just really want to talk about them and use them in the singular form so that we can talk about things that I, you, he and she have to do, should do, and so on. Let's start off with a simple one-verb sentence. Maybe let's say, ich lerne meine Vokabeln, which as we know, means I'm learning or maybe studying my vocab, something I hope we're all doing pretty regularly anyway. Okay, well, let's look at that. Let's get a little bit more context. Yes, you're learning your vocab, but what's the story behind that? Well, you know you have to learn your vocab to be able to string a sentence together. You must. So this is where our verb müssen comes in. And as I said, in singular forms, we often don't really even bother with verb endings. Have a look at this table up here, and you'll see what I mean. Even those pesky dots disappear in most of the singular forms. It's really only in the you forms that we need to think about endings, and here it's only the endings we're used to anyway, that st. Okay, anyway, look, so back to the vocab. Our sentence is now, ich muss am Wochenende meine Vokabeln lernen. I've got to learn my vocab at the weekend. Now, please, let's just take a minute to enjoy the beauty of that sentence. We've got a verb in the second place, just where we'd expect it. And our other verb is at the end. And all of those other German bits, our time phrase and our object, are nice and safe, tucked in between the two. And it's your modal verb muss in the second position. And the action verb lernen is way over at the end of the sentence in the infinitive form, in its full form. And this is just like we did with prognoses earlier. Okay, so look, I might say to you, there's a test on Monday. You have to learn your vocab at the weekend. So this would be, of course, du musst am Wochenende deine Vokabeln lernen. And you'll be thinking to yourself, yep, I should. Ja, ich soll am Wochenende meine Vokabeln lernen. I should learn my vocab at the weekend. You really know you probably should. And maybe, look, you even want to learn your vocab. Best of intentions and all of that. Ich will am Wochenende meine Vokabeln lernen. And here we notice that our verb wollen is a little bit more irregular than we might expect. The O changes relatively inexplicably into an I in the singular forms. I know, it's pretty crazy, huh? Okay, so anyway, you want to learn your vocab, but you just can't. You're simply not able to. There's no way. So you tell me, am Wochenende kann ich meine Vokabeln nicht lernen. Here again, we have a fairly irregular verb. You'll notice, look, we're using the verb können with that O with the dots. The O with the dots changes in most singular forms into an A, so it kind of looks like our English word can. Anyway, look, back to the vocab. Well, look, by now I'm thinking to myself, warum kannst du deine Vokabeln nicht lernen? Or if we're being formal, as we probably would be, I might ask, warum können Sie Ihre Vokabeln nicht lernen? Why can't you? You notice here our modal verb, like all of the others, behaves fairly normally here in the Z form. So why can't you learn your vocab? Well, the truth of it probably is, ich kann meine Vokabeln nicht lernen, denn ich will die neue Serie auf Netflix anschauen. And if I was your father here, I might say, ja, du möchtest die neue Serie anschauen. You would like to. That's what our verb möchten means. Ja, du möchtest die neue Serie anschauen, aber du darfst sie nicht anschauen. You're not allowed to. Du musst deine Vokabeln lernen. Well, luckily I'm not your dad, and well, you can do whatever you like. Of course, we'll have to have a look through the tables in our textbook to review all of the different forms of these modal verbs. But for now, our modal verbs, I think, are pretty easy to use. Here are a couple of things to know before we move on. Firstly, we don't really use them by themselves. They're used along with another action verb. In a normal sentence, our modal verb is in the second position, and our action verb is at the end of the sentence. The very end. Yep, over there at the very end. Any endings go on the modal verb, not on the action verb. And your action verb is in the infinitive form. And modal verbs have slightly different verb endings, especially for the ich forms and the er, sie, es forms. And on this point, the ich form and the er, sie, es forms are exactly the same. Well, let's finish up with some examples. Ich muss mein neues Buch lesen. I have to read my new book. Ich will am Samstag zum Markt gehen. I want to go to the market on Saturday. Ich soll meine Mutter anrufen. Should ring my mum. Ich kann ganz gut Gitarre spielen. I can play guitar pretty well. Ich möchte am Wochenende in die Berge gehen. I'd like to go into the mountains at the weekend. Well, that's modal verbs, but we are not done yet. I also want to look at a new kind of verb that we've met once or twice before. These are verbs that consist of two bits. Well, let me give you some examples so you can see what I mean. Ich nehme immer mein Handy mit. Always take my phone with me. Ich stehe oft sehr früh auf. I often get up really early. Ich rufe samstags meine Mutter an. I ring my mum on Saturdays. Ich sehe abends gern fern. I like watching TV in the evening. Wir kaufen bei Woolworths ein. We do our shopping at Woolworths. And there are lots more examples in your textbook, so I'm not going to go through them all here. I really just want you to understand how the verbs work. Here the thing to know is that each of these verbs consist of two bits. Let's take a common example, one that we've already mentioned. Ich sehe abends fern. All right, so think, what verb are we using here? Well, we're used to seeing the verb in the second position. So we might say our verb is sehen, the verb to see. But here, only some of the verb is in the second position and the rest of it is at the end of the sentence. Let's get rid of all of the other bits of the sentence and just look at the verb parts. And we're left with these two bits. So the verby bit is in the second position and the other bit is at the end. This is the prefix. Now you might be thinking to yourself at this moment, well, hang on, prefixes are always at the beginning, aren't they? And not the end. Well, this is kind of true. If we look the verb up in the dictionary, we can see that the infinitive form of the verb, the full form, or simply the form we find when we look things up in the dictionary, is written as one word. This is the verb fernsehen. And here the prefix fern is at the beginning of the word. But to use it, we need to separate it off and put it at the end of the sentence. And often the bit that's left is a verb that we are already familiar with. Let's take maybe another example. Say you want to talk about shopping, but you've forgotten what the word is. So look, just head over to Leo and look the word up in the dictionary. What you find is the verb einkaufen. Now we can't use it yet in this form. We're already familiar with the verb kaufen, which we know means to buy. But here there's an extra bit out the front. By using the verb with the prefix ein, we've modified the meaning of the verb to buy, and now it means to shop. And to use it, we kind of proceed as normal. We take the verb part kaufen and we use it as we normally would and save up that prefix until the very end of the sentence. So, ich kaufe jeden Samstag bei Woolworths ganz viel ein. And this prefix at the end, ein, tells me that we're not just buying, but we are shopping. There are quite a lot of separable verbs, and I've listed some of the more useful ones for you in our textbook. So look, I won't go through all of them here. Again, I think the important thing is is this knowledge that they exist. So when you look words up, you will recognize that maybe they might be separable verbs. And of course, we will know then hopefully how to use them. Let's take one more example, perhaps the verb schlafen. Now, I think we all know this verb. It means to sleep. Now, just like in English, we can modify this verb so that it expresses the idea of not only sleeping, but also the idea of sleeping in, which is a slightly more complex idea than just sleeping. And just like in English, we use an additional preposition to convey the idea of sleeping in. In English, obviously, we're using the preposition in, but in German, we use the preposition aus, which sort of conveys the idea that we've slept until we don't need to do it anymore. We've slept out. It kind of makes sense. And if we look the word up in the dictionary, we find exactly that. The verb for to sleep in is ausschlafen. So you can perhaps see how the words compare. In English, we have a verb and a separate preposition. In German, we have the same thing. But in the infinitive form, the preposition is attached to the verb as a prefix. If we want to use it to express the idea of sleeping in on a Saturday, we can say, ich schlafe gern samstags aus. Here the verb part with its usual endings is in the usual second position and the prefix is all the way over at the end. It'll be worth practicing some of the other verbs that you find useful, so check these out please in your textbook and keep an eye out for separable verbs when you're looking these words up in the dictionary. But before we finish up today, I want to show you how we can combine the ideas we've introduced today. So how we can use modal verbs and separable verbs together. And look, there's really no secret sauce needed. We just use them like normal verbs. And this is probably, I must say, the easiest way to use separable verbs, using them alongside a modal verb. So let's take again our verb to sleep in. And you'll remember that this is the verb ausschlafen. Okay, so let's think about some different scenarios. Maybe you want to sleep in. So this, of course, we'll have to use our verb wollen, and we end up with ich will samstags ausschlafen. And so we're using our modal verb in the normal way, nicely conjugated in the second position, just as you would with any other verb. And there's our other action verb, ausschlafen, although it's not much of an action, all the way over there at the end of the sentence in its usual infinitive form, exactly as we would find it in the dictionary. All right, look, so maybe you want to sleep in. Sie wollen ausschlafen. But you can't. Ich kann nicht ausschlafen. Why not? Here we can give some reasons. Well, maybe you have to work. Have to? We're using our verb müssen. Ich kann samstags nicht ausschlafen, denn ich muss samstags arbeiten. So hopefully you can see that it's no more difficult to use a separable verb with a modal verb than with any other verb. A couple more examples? Don't mind if I do. Let's think about calling relatives on the phone. We all know we should, so ich soll meine Tante anrufen. I really should ring my aunt, but ich will meine Tante nicht anrufen. You don't want to, so what do? Send her a text, huh? Es tut mir leid, ich muss heute arbeiten. So there we go, we've got a nice excuse. You're sorry, can't give her a ring, you've got to work. Okay, before we finish up, another progress check here. I'm going to show you some pictures and you are going to use the separable verb aussehen to describe what you see. This is a useful verb and we can use it to say how things or people look or appear to you. So for example, maybe you're looking at me and thinking, sieht müde aus, he looks tired. This will be a good excuse for you as well to learn some adjectives for different expressions or emotions, so it'll allow us to practice the separable verbs and some of our adjectives at the same time. But to make it a bit easier, I'll put in some possible adjectives before we start, maybe over here somewhere, and you can pause the video and check them out, or feel free to look up your own if you think these don't fit. Remember, since the verb aussehen is separable, you'll have to separate it like we were doing earlier. Anything else goes right in the middle. Well, off we go. Los geht's. Well, look, I hope that went okay. There is a similar exercise in your textbook, and you'll find some possible answers in the description below. And of course, Übung macht den Meister. So do head over now to your textbook, do read through Part C, Struktur, and try some of the Übungen. Und so, meine Freunde, das war's dann für heute und auch diese Woche. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Woche. Und wie immer, wenn Sie Fragen haben, schreiben Sie sie unten in den Kommentaren. Alles Gute, auf Wiedersehen und tschüss.